Thank you, Mitch. It is my pleasure to introduce Old Guard member Foster Osborne, who will be providing a contrarian view of Caesar's assassination. Foster is well known to the Old Guard. Many of you know him as a bridge player, but he is no ordinary bridge player. He is a life master. In fact, it was Foster who was the spark plug who got the Old Guard Bridge Group to join the ACBL, the American Contract Bridge League, which permitted the group to award master points. Many of you also know Foster as a former treasurer of the Old Guard, a natural role for him as he is a certified public accountant. But today we will view Foster from another dimension, as an historian. Foster was a history major at Middlebury College, and his passion for history extends far beyond his undergraduate days. He and his wife Pam are frequent attendees at the Middlebury Alumni College, which is held in the bucolic Green Mountains of Vermont. Foster tells me that the inspiration for today's talk came from one of the history courses they took at the Alumni College. Foster, thank you so much for doing this for the Old Guard. The Zoom microphone and stage are yours.
Thank you very much. Let me do the screen share. Okay, does everybody see my screen? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so here we have a very imposing gentleman, Mr. Julius Caesar. Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, who was in the right? The traditional view holds that Julius Caesar was a tyrant who broke the law by crossing the Rubicon with his troops. He got what he deserved when he was assassinated. That was certainly the view of our founding fathers, who definitely had a poor opinion of what Caesar did. My view was that Rome was a republic in name only. I might say that I'm handsome and good looking, but that really doesn't make it so. It was by the time Caesar was assassinated, the Roman Republic really wasn't a republic in any way. Political opponents killed each other for over 60 years. Dictators were a regular part of the Roman Republic. The people that killed Caesar were motivated often by jealousy and fear of losing their wealth, just as much as being mad at him for being successful. Caesar was a very great man, and I'll be going over his many accomplishments. So let's start at the beginning. There are two creation myths for Rome. We have Romulus and Remus. They were descended from the god Mars and were, as everyone knows, suckled by a wolf. Romulus goes and kills Remus and then founds Rome. The second creation myth is the story of Aeneas. He was descended from Venus. He fought in the Trojan War. He made his way to Carthage. He fooled around with Queen Dido, abandoned her and left her to help in the founding of Rome. I put in a quote here, arma virumque cano, of arms and the Mandai sing, which is the first line of Virgil's Aeneid. I once had a date with a woman who I was taking her to the Metropolitan Opera to hear Hector Berlioz's Les Troyens. She called me up to confirm the date later that night. And she asked what I was doing. And I said, well, I'm actually reading Virgil's Aeneid. And she goes, what language are you reading it in? And I said, well, English, of course. And she said, well, I read it in the original Greek. And I said, well, that's unusual since the Aeneid was originally written in Latin. So she wasn't, our relationship didn't go anywhere on that one. So Roman history was founded in 753 as a kingdom and lasted until 509 BC when King Superbus was overthrown by Lucius Junius Brutus. I love that name, Superbus. I have this vision of a Greyhound bus roaring down the Appian Way. The Roman Republic Constitution was not a written document like the United States, but more like the British Constitution, which is a series of laws. The Romans liked to fight. They were good at it. And there was constant warfare between 509 and 264 BC. Interestingly, the Gauls sacked Rome in 387, which the Romans remembered that. They weren't too happy about that, and they didn't like the memory. Well, now we hit the Punic Wars, which is the sort of the high point of the Roman Republic. It's when the Republic really worked well. And the Punic comes from Phoenician because Carthage was founded by Phoenicians. And in the map here, you see Rome is controlling most of Italy, and Carthage has got colonies in Africa, in Spain, and Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily. The first war was over Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica. And it lasted 23 years. These wars went on forever. Rome was successful and took over Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. The second war was the big one. That lasted from 2018 to 202. And that's the one with Hannibal and the elephants. Hannibal invaded Rome, and or invaded Italy, I should say, and he was pretty dominant. The Battle of Cannae is considered one of the great battles of all time. It was a brilliant victory for Hannibal. The Romans decided that the best defense was an offense, and they invaded the Carthage homeworld. Hannibal was called back. There was an epic battle, the Battle of Zama, and Hannibal lost and Carthage was defeated. The Romans kept Carthage around. They didn't completely destroy it. They waited until another 50 years, 149 to 146, where they went in and totally destroyed Carthage. It was in the same year, with the Battle of Corinth, Rome became ruler of Greece. So this was really the high point of the Republic. I'm going to spend some time talking about what a republic is and the Roman Republic, because it goes to the sense of what Caesar did was right or wrong. If the Republic really was viable and it was a strong republic, then what Caesar did was wrong. But my feeling is it was not. So what is a republic? We'll start with Plato, because he wrote the famous book, Plato's Republic. And he identifies political justice as harmony in a structured political body. An ideal society consists of three main classes of people. And these three classes work together in harmony. Each group must perform its appropriate function, and only that function. It's important to notice that he picked three, and three is a good number for a republic, because if you have only two, they go head to head and there's conflict. But three works as a balancing act. You note the word harmony in Plato's Republic. I think it's hard for a republic to work in harmony. Political parties are a natural fact, and they're always going to be fighting with each other. So now we come to the SPQR, the Senate and People of Rome. And republic is actually res publica, or that public thing. And it really was more than just the Senate running Rome. Now, there was a Greek named Polybius, who in around 150 BC analyzed why the Romans had become so dominant. and he thought the Roman Republic was the answer. This was a very important work. It was read by Madison 1900 years later when he was framing the Constitution. Polybius saw three types of government, each with a threat to continuation. You have a monarchy, which can devolve into a tyranny. You have an aristocracy that can devolve into oligopoly. And you have democracy, which can devolve into mob rule. The Roman Republic addressed those threats by checks and balances. So the Roman Republic had three equal branches of government. It had the consuls, which were two at a time, elected for only 1 year, and elected by the tribal assemblies. The tribal assemblies were the representatives of the people. And the consuls had executive power. Now one consul could veto the other consul's actions. The second branch would be the Senate, ruled by elders. Name comes from Latin sens, or old man. Not an elected body, but appointed. And the third group were the tribunal assemblies, representing the people, elected leaders called tribunes, and they had veto power over Senate and consul action. There were checks and balances, so no branch could become supreme. Now I'm going to give you a slide that's going to test your eyesight. Whoa. Yeah, I would suggest you put your eyeball about 1 inch away from your computer screen. This is the Constitution of the Roman Republic. And you have the Century Assembly, which was really more of an aristocracy group. And they would elect the consuls. The Senate, they played a central role in the day-to-day functioning. They controlled the treasury. They had most of the experienced politician, made foreign and military policy, and directed domestic policy. And then the third was the tribal assembly, which is the assembly of the plebes. And then the tribal assembly included all of the different groups. And there was a smaller group, the plebe council, which didn't have too much power. Take a look over at the right, and you see the executive magistrates. You have the consuls, the praetors, and then the one, my favorite, is the censors. If you ever wondered why the word census and censorship are the same, even though they're different functions, it's because of the Roman job of censors. Censors were given two main responsibilities. One was to count people and put them in the correct assembly. And the second was to enforce moral laws, keep people well behaved. The censors could remove a senator, which is interesting that they had that value. They could also expel them or censor them. So the censors were quite a strong group. We'll go down the list of the other magistrates later. Now, as I said, the founding fathers absolutely loved the Roman Republic. As you know, we have among us one of the most admiring of Hamilton people, and that's, as a member here, Nolan Ash. I called him up and I said, Nolan, is it going to be all right if I talk about this subject? And because he's going to be talking about the founding of the Constitution in a month. And he assured me it was okay. I was a little worried that if I criticized Alexander Hamilton, Nolan might assassinate me. But he assured me that his daggers were safely packed in the attic and I was okay. What Hamilton is saying in Federalist Paper 34 is he's trying to make the case for why the Constitution has a bicameral legislature, and one being for the aristocrats, one being for the people. And he was making the case that the Romans had done it before the United States did it. My problem with this paper is the last sentence, where he puts, and the Roman Republic attained to the utmost height of human greatness. Now, I understand why Hamilton's doing this. He's basically saying, look, if the Romans, which have a great republic, did it, then we should do it. But the Roman Republic wasn't that great. And it's a little disconcerting that all our founding fathers thought that the Republic was so wonderful. George Bernard Shaw wrote a play called Caesar and Cleopatra. It's never performed. But he was sort of on my side. He put in this fictional statement by Caesar, where Caesar said, Caesar is no Caesarian. Were Rome a true republic, then were Caesar the first of republicans. So when I talk about my being a contrarian view, it's really against what the founding fathers believed, but there are plenty of people out there, including George Bernard Shaw and William Shakespeare, who recognized that there were many shortcomings to the Roman Republic. And again, the reason why I'm dwelling on this is because if the Roman Republic wasn't such a great thing, then it really wasn't right for them the assassins to kill Caesar. He was a great man. He accomplished a lot. And yes, he did arrogantly claim power, but it wasn't a republic that he overthrew. Now, after the Punic Wars, things started to go a little awry. The Punic Wars almost gave the Romans a common enemy that they could unite upon. During the earlier part of the Republic, there were disagreements, usually between the Senate and the assemblies, over who had power and what was going to be the proper balance between the two. But factionalism really started after the Punic Wars. And there were two political groups. I put down parties, but they were really two different ways of thinking. They didn't have like a modern party with platforms and discipline. They were more just different ways of thinking. The first political party were the Optimates, and that comes from the Latin for best ones. They were conservative, they liked the status quo, they believed in the supremacy of the Senate over popular assemblies. They were opposed to immigrants outside of Rome becoming citizens. And they favored the rich and the landowners. The other political party were called the Populares, and that today, the English version would be populism. They favored the plebeians over the patricians. They were constantly concerned about debt relief. Debt was a major problem for the plebeians. Most of the wealth was owned by the patricians, and it was often a big burden. For example, if you became too much in debt and couldn't pay it off, you were required to sell yourself and your children, your wife, into slavery. That was a pretty drastic way of handling debt problems. Land reform was becoming more and more of a problem. They've included outsiders as Roman citizens. One of Caesar's many accomplishments was to allow the citizens or the people of northern Italy, north of the Po River, to be included as Roman citizens. And that embracing of other peoples was followed out by his successor, Augustus. And they favored the tribal assemblies over the Senate, and they believed in the grain dole. The grain dole I'll go back to that. The grain dole was a very Roman situation. In the end, both parties accepted they had to do it because there was such poverty in Rome. They had to give out a lot of free grain, free bread, and it's part of the bread and circus duo that is so well known in Roman times. And the circuses were to entertain the populace and keep them quiet, and the bread was to keep them fed so that they didn't revolt. So what went wrong with the Roman Republic? Well, land reform was really one of the biggest problems. Who fights wars? Well, men who were pulled off their farms, saw their farms' productivity decline and the value reduced. Rich oligarchs jumped in and bought the land. The plebes were forced to live on the streets of Rome. The Rome of the Republic wasn't that nice a place. In the center was the Forum and the temples, but ringing around the core were tenements of the worst kind. Further out were the homes of the rich oligarchs. Slavery was 30% of the population. And you can see that the rich landowners would much prefer having slaves to having freedmen working on their estates. Slavery was not popular with the slaves. There were 3 servile wars, the most famous being the third one, which was led by the gladiator Spartacus. The Romans had invented excruciating new punishments. I use the word excruciating because the base for that word excruciating is crucifixion, which is an unbelievably painful way to die. It's long and just very unpleasant. I put in brigandage. The parties would often hire armed guards to beat up or kill their opponents. This was particularly true of the Optimates. They seemed to have a real hatred towards the populares, and I'll give you some examples later of all the populist leaders that they murdered. I've talked about debt and currency hoarding. Well, who owns the currency? It's going to be the rich people. They didn't really have banks to, where you deposit your money and then the bank would then lend it out. And so this currency hoarding by the rich really hurt the economy. It was not a way for people to develop and own their own property. They couldn't borrow easily. If they did borrow, the interest rates were extremely high. And they were caught in a very tight noose. Okay. Now, Livy is an ancient Roman historian. And he indicates that Rome lost liberty through their own conquest, morally undermining consequences. There were over 17 wars between the last Punic War and Caesar's assassination, a span of 100 years. And the wars went on for a long time, and sometimes they fought, and it didn't seem to be for any good reason. The social wars were an example. This was where, as I mentioned earlier, the people outside of Rome in Italy wanted to become Roman citizens. The Romans, the Optimates, did not want them. So a war developed, and the Romans defeated the surrounding cities. And the consequence of their winning was that they gave their surrounding cities citizenship in Rome. And you sort of go, huh? What the hell is that about? Why fight a war and then give your opponents exactly what they were asking for? And it was the Roman nature to fight. Caesar's own war, the Gallic War, went on for 8 years. Now, I've mentioned earlier about the popularity's leaders being murdered, and there's a long list of them. The Gracchus are the most famous. Um, Tiberius came in, he pushed through a land reform. He couldn't get it through the Senate, so he had to go to the assemblies. He was murdered in the same year with clubs by slaves doing the Senate's bidding. His younger brother picked up the torch and tried to do even more reform legislation regarding judicial proceedings. He was chased down by a mob, forced to cross the Tiber, and committed suicide. Now, the next, in 100 BC, a tribune who wanted affordable grain for the proletariat, he was murdered by an Optimate death squad. Drusus, a tribune, extended voting franchise to large portions of Italy, stabbed to death in 91 BC. Assassin was never sought out. Rufus, tribune and friend of Drusus, attempted to carry on Drufus's reforms. He was hunted down by Optimate's death squad and killed in 88 BC. Claudius, that's one way of spelling it, a later version is Claudius, came from one of the most exalted of Roman families. He was a tribune of the plebes, and he pushed through a grain dole. He feuded with Cicero and was murdered by an Optimate gang, including Cicero was in alliance with Cato, who I'm going to talk about later, and he and their friend Milo did the killing, and he was never punished for it. So as the Republic slowly died, there rose up strong men. The first was Gaius Marius, 7 times a consul, and I list all the years. He, the Roman Constitution says you can only be a consul once every 10 years, but you can see that the laws were starting to break down by all these consulships that he was elected to in a very short space of time. He made one change that was telling, which was that he had soldiers show their support to the commanders rather than to the Republic. So there was no oath taking of a pledge of allegiance to the Republic. Instead, the pledge was to their commanding officer. He was an uncle to Caesar. He leaned towards the Popularis Party, and he was one of the first of the major generals. Now, there was a long list of generals from about 100 BC to the time of Augustus. And you see here Marius, Sulla, Crassus, Pompey the Great, Caesar, Anthony, and then Agrippa. Agrippa did the fighting for Augustus. So those were very dominant, those generals, and they were all quite good at fighting. In reaction to Marius came along Sulla. He was an Optimate supporter. He rose in response to Marius's domination. Very telling, in 88 BC, well before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Sulla marched his forces into Rome and occupied it. So when people, especially our founding fathers, complained about Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Sulla had already done it. And so it wasn't anything new. Now, Cicero was beloved by our founding fathers. There's a great book out now called First Principles, which I recommend to anyone. And it's about how our founding fathers loved the ancient Greek and Roman writing and civilization. Cicero was particularly admired by John Adams. He was a great man of letters and oratory. He was much admired during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Very much Caesar's foe. But interestingly, the assassins did not ask him to join. He came from the equestrian class, not a patrician, a social climber. He was a sycophant to the patrician optimates. Along with his ally Milo, feuded with Clodius, ended in Clodius's death. He's now looked upon a bit as a pompous blowhard, still very much taught in Latin classes. But now the Catiline conspiracy, our founding fathers believe that this was an evil man who tried to overthrow the Roman Republic, and he was a popularist, he was a populist, he was trying to help the poor. But Cicero exposed his machinations, and he was defeated. And so it gives a sense that Cicero was not the great man that he thought he was. All right, so now we finally reach Julius Caesar. Little is known of his childhood. I love this story. I wonder if it's apocryphal, but the story is he was kidnapped by pirates. And he got along with the pirates while he was being held. And they asked for 20 talents in ransom. And he was upset, and he said, no, you have to double that. You have to ask for 50. And he told them that even though he was getting along with them, that after he was freed, he would come back and he would capture them and he would crucify them. And that's exactly what happened. The pirates thought he was joking, but he was not joking. As an act of kindness, Caesar had the throats of the pirates slit so that they wouldn't suffer too long on the cross. Caesar was a very, he believed in giving clemency. And so I guess you could say that's a type of clemency when you slit someone's throat rather than crucify him. It had to be on Caesar's terms. And particularly, he was not forgiving of Cato at all. And most famously, Brutus got on the wrong side of Caesar in Caesar's war with Pompey. And Caesar defeated Pompey, and now Brutus is among the vanquished. But Caesar forgave him, and I put a little joke in here, maybe it's not Caesar's brightest move. So here is Julius Caesar's full name. The nomen, which is the middle name, indicates the Julii family. He's an old patrician family, but not rich. The cognomen is Caesar to cut, believed to have come from an ancestor born by Caesarean section. He was often in debt. He borrowed from Crassus, who was the richest man in Rome. The Gallic Wars, which Caesar didn't really have to fight, he kind of made trouble and caused a military action. But it allowed him to build up wealth from booty and slaves. Here we see the hypocrisies of Caesar. A lot of the police problems came from slaves tilling the land and taking away work from the freedmen. But Caesar needed to sell slaves taken from Gaul in order to pay for his very extravagant lifestyle. So he was a popularist, except when he needed money. I don't mean when I go through this to act like Caesar was pure. He was a tough cookie. But at the same time, he had policies that helped people. He wasn't out just for himself. Caesar followed what's called a cursus honorarum, which is a career path, and it's a standard one for someone trying to move up in the ranks. He had 10 years of military duty. He was a military tribune. He was a questor, which was the lowest ranking magistrate. Their job was mainly to deal with the treasury. He was an aedile, a higher magistrate, which took care of buildings, games, the grain dole, that type of thing. He was a praetor, which is the magistrate just below consul, a civil judge. In case of the consul's absence, he had consular powers. Interestingly, at the age of 37, he was elected Pontifex Maximus, or chief pontiff. earlier in his life, Caesar's first job was as a priest for the god Saturn. He ran into trouble with Sulla and had to flee Rome and had to give up his job as priest. But it is interesting that he had this religious bent. It's also interesting that the title he had, Pontifex Maximus, still hangs around today. Well, the first triumvirate came in to replace Sulla, and it included Pompey the Great, known as the Teenage Butcher, because he had killed quite a few people when he was still a teenager. And he went off and had his army and dealt with Spain. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, put down the Spartacus rebellion, and he dealt with Turkey. And Caesar, the youngest of the three, conquered Gaul. He borrowed money from Crassus. In 70 BC, after defeating Spartacus, Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls. Each camped their army outside of Rome. So there again, you're going like, well, Caesar was really heavily criticized for crossing the Rubicon. And yet here are these other guys who were bringing their armies to the outskirts of Rome. Now, the Gallic Wars were from 58 BC to 50. It took a long time. You'll note that Caesar did go into Great Britain, and he fought and a country that was pretty civilized. It was not like the Germanic tribes, which were a little bit more less of a civilized group. The Gauls were civilized. They actually looked down on the Romans in some ways because they were taller and they drank their wine pure while the Romans watered down their wine. It was a stunning victory. It took a long time, but he eventually won, and he was very popular with the people for it. Now, when Crassus died, only Pompey and Caesar were left. Their alliance started to unravel. Caesar had earlier cemented their relationship by having his daughter Julia marry Pompey. When you talk about the Republic, of course, the idea of women's rights were non-existent. But to show how badly the women were treated, they really weren't given a name. If Caesar had had two daughters, they would have been Julia the older and Julia, or the elder, and Julia the younger. Unfortunately, Julia died in childbirth, which caused problems because Caesar wanted to renew the relationship and find another family member to marry off to Pompey, but Pompey declined. It's a strange system, isn't it, for a republic to use marriage as a way of gluing together alliances. I wrestled for quite a while with Cato the Younger. Cato is beloved by George Washington, and anyone that is beloved by George Washington deserves respect. They were somewhat similar personalities. Cato was stoic, extremely righteous, incorruptible, believer in the Republic. Later revered as a model of how a public servant should act, George Washington admired him. He had his shortcoming. He was an alcoholic, and he was very uncompromising. Caesar had him physically thrown out of the Senate. Caesar was trying to push through a land reform, and Cato, being an optimist, wanted to keep the status quo and protect the rich people, and he was causing problems. So Caesar, as consul, threw him out of the Senate, which led to a real blood feud between the two of them, which would have dire consequences. Now, after Caesar had won the battle in Gaul, Cato and Pompey conspired to order him back without his troops, He was relieved of his generalship and his consul, and he had to come back as an ordinary citizen. Caesar was willing to compromise on this. He said, well, I'll do that if Pompey will do it. And so both of us will return sort of unguarded. And Pompey was agreeable to it at first, but Cato said no. Cato was uncompromising, and he said, no, Caesar, you come back, and Pompey can keep his troops. And so when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it was almost like he didn't have any choice, because he knew that he was going to get arrested. He knew he might get either exiled or executed. And what choice did he have? He tried to compromise, and it didn't work. So I like to, as I try to figure out Cato and how to deal with his situation, I'd like to go back to Plato's Republic. And the parable of the cave is an interesting story by Plato. And in it, you can imagine people chained to a wall, looking at this wall, looking out at the wall, and behind them is a fire, and then puppets are in front of the fire that reflect shadows on the cave's wall that the chained people are looking at. And Plato says all they can perceive is what's the shadows. They don't really know the entire situation. And I think that's a little bit the case with Cato. I mean, to him, the Republic was still functioning. The assemblies were electing consuls, the Senate was still meeting, the censors were doing their jobs. Everything was functioning from Cato's perspective. So when Caesar came in and overthrew the Republic, Cato saw this as, the worst of all crimes. Well, here it is. And when I looked at it, I couldn't believe it. I said, this is it? This tiny little brook, this famous little brook? I couldn't believe it. Well, Caesar crossed. He had no choice, he felt. He had to come into Rome, and he only took one legion. And he came into Rome, crossed the Rubicon on January 10th. He didn't make a big deal of it in his own writings. He just said, oh, one day he went to the next town south of the Rubicon. I still can't believe that this famous river is such a little dinky thing. So let's take a look at what Caesar accomplished. He's famous for his writings on the subject. Historians of the Gallic Wars, they make for great Latin lessons for students. Perhaps their accuracy is not as good. As I've already mentioned, he began the integration of Roman territories outside of Italy and bringing them and making the people there citizens of Rome. He instituted financial reforms. There was no hoarding of currency. Property had to be valued at the pre-Civil War value. So Civil War being the fight he had with Pompey. Because the value had dropped, which was a great deal for the holders of debt, because they could foreclose on the property and still have the debt holders owe him more money. He found new settlements for veterans. He did land reform. 20,000 families were given farmland. They had to have at least 3 children. Large landowners were required to have 1/3 of the workers be freedmen. Debt reform, no selling yourself into slavery anymore. He canceled the interest due. He canceled 1 year's rent on low value housing. He eliminated about 1/4 of all outstanding debt. And he offered people jobs in public works, particularly going to other parts of the Republic's territory and rebuilding, let's say, Carthage. He increased duties on imported goods in order to encourage more domestic production. I mean, that's pretty far-reaching for back then. He secured the tribune's legislative power. He weakened the Senate control over the treasury. He expanded the Senate from 600 to 900 with equestrians, provincials from Spain and Gaul. Now, if you were a believer that Caesar was evil or you didn't like him, you might think that this was just a power grab, that he put in his own people in the Senate as a way of controlling it. And you'd be right. But the Senate was very dominated by rich oligarchs. And what he did, I think, was appropriate. There was, and interestingly, he had public postings of the Senate and Assembly meetings so that the people could read what was going on. But the most lasting was something that we still live today. Its most lasting accomplishment. Every day of the week, every week of the month, every month of the year, it is the calendar. Before Caesar changed the calendar, it was a mess. The days were often wrong. Farmers didn't know when to plant their crops. And so Caesar, who was a student of astronomy, he said, well, it takes the Earth, a year is 365 days and 1/4 day. He was actually off by 11 minutes. The Earth goes around the sun in 365 days, 5 hours and 49 minutes. And 11 minutes, you go, what's the big deal? But it did add up so that by 1500, Pope Gregory had to revise the calendar. And today, we skip 3 leap years every 400 years. And that makes up for the inaccuracy. Occasionally, we'll have a leap second. The last one was in 2016. But for the most part, it was quite a major accomplishment, the calendar, and it's still with us. So here's a painting of Caesar being killed. I don't think it was, these guys were as capable as shown here. There were 23 stab wounds, but only one was fatal. The rich oligarchs must have been a little out of shape, or perhaps they didn't mean to kill him, but only give him a warning. I can't say which, but it's very strange to me. There were 23 stab wounds, but only one was fatal. There were about 60 conspirators. After the murder, Mark Antony, the other consul, forgave the assassins, which is interesting because they could have gone free, except for the fact that people would have none of it. And instead, the assassins were hunted up and executed. It took them a while to get them all, but they pretty much got all of them. So how noble was Brutus? Shakespeare calls Brutus the noblest Roman of them all because he acted for moral reasons rather than selfish concerns. I don't think so. He was a usurer. He was very rich. He loaned out money to a Cypriot town called Salamis in 50 BC at 48% interest. They wouldn't pay up. He had the Roman military besiege the town elders until they paid up. In the process, 5 of the elders starved to death. You see here a double standard. Leaders who took up the popular standard are faulted as ambitious and power hungry, while the assassins are depicted as disinterested stalwarts of Republican virtue. And I don't think so. I don't think Brutus was just concerned about himself, about Rome. He was concerned about himself. So the assassins' motives, supposedly they were motivated by the love of republic and the need to remove a tyrant. But there was more to it, jealousy. Caesar was given honors, not them. Caesar was arrogant and he showed disrespect to the senators. They came to call on him one time to tell him of honors they had bestowed upon him, and he wouldn't stand up. And the senators found that, took great umbrage in that. There were grudges against Caesar. He favored some people over others. He favored Pompey's followers more than his own. Anthony famously crowned Caesar 3 times as king, and Caesar refused. But the conspirators thought this was all an act. Caesar was testing the water to see if the people would like him to be king. Most telling, the assassins had no plan for what they were going to do once the deed was done. Wouldn't you think they would have planned that all out ahead of time? So they were caught in disarray as soon as they killed Caesar. If they really were trying to do this for the love of the Republic and not for personal vendettas, I think they would have had a plan. Now, this is sort of the end of the story. Anthony and Caesar's heirs, Octavius, sought out and killed the assassins. They also killed Cicero for good measure, even though Cicero was not part of the conspiracy. Anthony and Octavius had a falling out in a subsequent civil war. At the Battle of Actium, Octavius, later Augustus, defeated Anthony and Cleopatra. The Roman people, grown tired of constant civil war, made Augustus emperor and gladly gave up the remnants of democracy. The Republic remained, but in name only. But that had been the case for the last 75 years. So here we go. I'm going to take you back to one of our first slides. Here is Augustus, and with his being made emperor, there began 200 years of Pax Romana. And I ask you, what's that kid doing down there at Caesar's right leg? And if we had an interactive face-to-face meeting, I'd ask for people to guess, but I can't. And so I'll tell you, the baby or the child is Cupid. And why on earth is Cupid hanging around Caesar? Well, Cupid's parents were Mars and Venus. And those two gods were the founders of Rome. So by having Cupid attached to Caesar and praising him, they're showing that Caesar was descended from the gods, certainly from Venus, because Julius Caesar claimed to be a descendant of Venus. And he has the approval of the Roman gods for his role as emperor. Now, why are we still talking about the assassination of Julius Caesar 2,000 years ago? And my answer is easy. William Shakespeare. If you're going to have William Shakespeare write about you, it's going to be remembered. Julius Caesar is the most read and performed of all the histories. There are more popular plays by Shakespeare. Midsummer Night's Dream is the most often performed, and the most read perhaps is Hamlet. But this one is pretty ubiquitous, and you have to say, well, it has a reason. I mean, I studied it in high school, and it's got some great lines, which I'm going to go over. The final curtain call goes to Brutus after the play is over. His torment on whether to kill Caesar is the most difficult acting role. So who does Shakespeare think is right? Those two different sides that we started with. And for the most part, he gave an even handling of the issue. But he shows a little bit of whose side he's on by the two eulogies given on Caesar after his assassination, one by Mark Antony and one by Brutus. Mark Antony is written in iambic pentameter. So an iamb is 2 syllables. The second syllable is stressed. So it would be friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. And that's certainly a more dramatic way of speaking than Brutus's oration. Not that I loved Caesar less, but I loved Rome more, was written in flat prose. So I think Shakespeare is showing a little bit of bias towards my view. I'm just putting some lines for Julius Caesar to show how famous the play is and why the fame of that play is probably the main reason why we're here today talking about the assassination. Beware the Ides of March, one of my favorites. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Upon what meat does this our Caesar feed that he has grown so great? Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. It was Greek to me. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. Et tu, brute? Friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears. Now, this is by far my favorite line because it ties in with what I've been saying. When the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. The evil men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bone. This was the noblest Roman of them all. Now, there was a famous production of Julius Caesar in November of 1864 at the Winter Garden Theater in New York City because they had three brothers perform the main roles. Their family name was Booth. In the middle is Edmund, who played Brutus. On the right is Julius, who played Cassius. And on the left was the baby brother, John, who played Mark Antony. And I put in a little joke because I said, too bad they didn't pick A Midsummer Night's Dream to perform. History might have been different because 5 months after this production, the baby brother assassinated Abraham Lincoln. And John Wilkes Booth clearly was affected by Julius Caesar. In his last written words, here are some of the last written words he made. After being hunted down like a dog through swamps, woods, and last night being chased by gunboats till I was forced to return wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against me, I am here to despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, anyone who has questions, please raise your hand using the reaction button. Al Aho, unmute yourself.
Great talk. I took 4 years of Latin in high school, and I did not realize what the ambience of my course was like. But when I took the course, we pronounced Caesar Kaiser. And I understand in Latin, it's a hard C instead of a soft C. It was Cicero, not Cicero. When did the pronunciation change?
I don't know. I've always heard it as Caesar. I remember taking Latin and everyone joking that we couldn't call Cicero, we had to call him Cicero. And certainly you're right that if we wanted to properly pronounce it in Latin, we should use the hard C.
Mitch,
Am I up?
you're up.
Okay. The chemist in me just has to ask if there's any overlay of some of the infrastructure and poisoning, specifically the lead poisoning that went on for hundreds of years there in what happened. I mean, we now know that lead leads to violent behavior, and these guys were certainly violent. And part of the decline of the Roman Empire was just the lack of maintenance of their infrastructure. Does that fit into your story at all, Foster?
No, I can't. I think it's a good point. When I suggested I make this speech, I was a little worried because this is a huge topic and really could be a course for a whole semester or 2 semesters of college. But lead poisoning, I'm sure, was a problem. This culture is very violent. I mean, just think of the gladiators and people going to watch others get killed. This is not nice behavior. And the crucifixions and the constant murdering. It could be that lead caused it, but I think it's just part of the culture.
Ron Hoke, you're next.
Thank you. Very interesting, Foster, very interesting. I'd like to add a short historical tidbit. when Hannibal invaded Rome at the beginning of the Second Punic War, there was a well-known wealthy Roman farmer named Cincinnatus. He abandoned his farm and rushed to the defense of the Roman Empire, a Roman Republic, rather, at that time. In fact, he became their leading general and was largely responsible for the Romans defeating Hannibal and winning the Second Punic War. He was so popular after the war that the people wanted to put him in command of the Roman government. But he said no. He abandoned all honors and all that went with it and returned to his farm and again became a farmer. After the end of our Revolutionary War, the American military officers who had abandoned their civilian professions rushed to the defense of the colonies and then returned back to civilian life after the end of the war and refused all the honors that could have come to them because of their military careers during the defense of the American colonies, decided to form a group, and they called themselves the Order of the Cincinnati, Cincinnati being the plural of Cincinnatus. So they all considered themselves to be to have led a life modeled after Cincinnatus. And in order to make that model one of lasting value and one that people would know about and keep in their minds for a long, long time, they convinced the people that lived in a small Ohio River town called Losantiville to change their name to Cincinnati. And that fact is noted in a park on the Ohio River in downtown Cincinnati with a statue of Cincinnatus with one hand on the plow and looking into the distance, hearing the call to defend the Roman Empire and doing it. And the Order of the Cincinnati wanted to preserve their example by naming themselves after Cincinnatus and naming the town Cincinnati.
Yeah, we actually have a member of the Society of Cincinnati as a member of the Old Guard. That's Todd Packer. And it's a very prestigious membership because they don't expand the number. And it's based upon being a descendant of one of Washington's officers. So it's really quite a feather in his cap that he is a member of this group. And they meet every year, and it's very illustrious. But Cincinnatus, George Washington very much admired Cincinnatus.
Tony Versace? Tony Versace? Tony? Unmute. Tony, you're muted.
Am I okay now?
Yep, you're okay.
All right. Thanks very much, Oscar. That was a very interesting presentation. However, could you go back to the slide where you quoted the first line of the Aeneid? Because you've got a typo there.
I got a typo?
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. What did I put in there? What should I have typed?
Arma virumque cano. It should be arma et verumque cano.
Thank you. I'll change that.
And then when you go to talking about Cato, you must remember the famous line of Cato, Carthago delenda est. Slip that in as a famous phrase.
Yes.
And when he crossed the Rubicon, it was, I forget who it was, but quoted him as saying, alia iacta est, which also is another famous phrase from.
Yes, well, the die is cast.
Yeah.
There's some Well, Cato was he was an interesting man. He was a Stoic, and but he not completely a Stoic. The Romans had a very odd attitude towards marriage. They would trade their wives around, and Cato his wife was desired by another man, a rich man, so he gave his wife to the rich man, and they married. And then the rich man died, and the wife inherited the money and came back and remarried Cato. So sort of that guy, he might have been a Stoic, but he wasn't any fool. But the wives were sort of traded around like property. It was not a very nice system, certainly not one of female equality.
Thank you.
Miguel?
Thank you. I think that was an excellent presentation. You have opened my eyes to so many different things. I just want to go over a couple of them. First of all, to Alejo's question, Caesar or Kaiser. Kaiser was the Germanic pronunciation. If you went to a Christian Brothers school where they had the Latin pronunciation and Italian phrase, you had Caesar, just like you had Caesarean section. The Germanic Caesar, Kaiser, led to the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia. So anyway, it's a northern-southern pronunciation contest. You didn't mention Caesar's wife. That at least I don't think you did. She was the daughter of one of the richest consuls and somebody who enabled Caesar to become consul. I visited the replica or the actual movement of his house in California. The Getty Museum is the house of Caesar's father-in-law, if anybody ever wants to see it. The main thing that you showed me is, and you've opened my eyes, the parties, the optimists and the populists, I guess maps to our Republicans and Democrats, but you show me history repeats itself. So they had 3 slave wars. Well, we're in the middle of our 3rd. We had the first one in the revolution was a compromise of the Electoral College, which we'll talk about later. Then we had a real civil war. And now we're in the middle of our 3rd slave war, which we call the Jim Crow era. So it's amazing how all of these things map. And, the Gracchus brothers there were the Kennedy brothers now. And there's so many different things that are in parallel. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Do you think anyone could draw a parallel of the things that happened to Romans history using your presentation, which was eye-opening and excellent, and the American history, except we're doing it much faster because we have better communication. But thank you. I don't know if you have a comment on that, but that's what I heard. I heard that we are on the same path in a parallel, rhyming what the whole Romans did, falling victims to the same troubles.
Yes, well, I after January 6th, I called up Steve Varley and I said, maybe I shouldn't be giving this presentation. It's a little too close to home and people might think that I'm trying to give a message. And Steve assured me that that was okay, that history is in the past. There are obviously, and certainly what happened on January 6th with the armed mob taking over the Capitol building for a brief moment, it does remind you of the armed guards, armed gangs that the optimists used to subdue the populace. I think there are a lot of similarities, but there are also quite a few differences. We're just, but it is a lesson that we have to be, the founding fathers, the reason they liked Cato and the others was because they believed in virtue. And there's a lot to be said for virtue, and not just female virtue, but male virtue too, and behaving properly. And I think if we want to come out with one lesson from this talk, it's to try to behave better.
Yeah, my last comment is when I took Latin for 3 years in Catholic school, I had Christian brother Henry. He was quite old. and he actually served in Caesar's 10th Legion, and told us all about how they their bridge building and road building was how they kept the army busy.
Yes. Well, and Caesar had a product of getting poor people to work. He sent them out to rebuild. It was, you know, almost like FDR with some of his
Infrastructure projects.
Fred, Arnold?
Yes, Foster, thank you. Most timely. Given your depth of knowledge here in reading, if you had to characterize Caesar, say almost like a character analysis, if you were to walk in or present to the Summit Old Guard at some point, how would you describe him? What was he about? What was he like in person?
Oh, I think he was quite arrogant, full of himself, sure of himself, very capable, certainly militarily, but also he had good intentions. He wanted to do the right thing. He could forgive when it suited him. Cato did not get forgiven. Cato, rather than to submit to Caesar, he committed suicide. That shows a certain not nice quality. Caesar's first co-consul was from the Optimist Party, and Caesar didn't want any part of him, and he had his followers, Caesar's followers, sort of harass the man to the point that they poured buckets of feces on him. So this is not a nice man. He's not someone that I'd want as a friend, but I have to admire him. For his time, he was very accomplished.
And given accomplishments, he accomplished across politics, authorship, law, military. That's pretty amazing, cross-disciplinary. Who else would have done that? A Churchill, a Lincoln? If you had to put a finger on what his genius was about that helped him cross all those and excel, what might that be?
Supreme confidence. He really believed in himself. So I don't even know what his early family was, but I read once in a statement about Franklin Roosevelt, never fear for an only child that is a male. The thought of failure never crosses their mind. And I think that was what helped Caesar. Was he just didn't believe he was ever going to be defeated. He had supreme confidence in himself.
Excellent insight. Thank you.
Bill Tittle?
Yeah, great presentation, very informative, Foster. But I got to say, I find the history of the Romans somewhat depressing, as if ultimately we end up fighting each other and the strongest guy wins. And but you seem to be an optimistic guy. Am I being too wussy about this? I mean, can you take the history of Rome and end up an optimist?
Well, sure. I mean, it eventually led to 200 years of Pax Romana. I mean, that's a pretty long run. And yes, some of the emperors were problematic, but the civil wars, which killed huge amounts of people in the first century BC, they ended by turning, by Caesar grabbing power. He set the stage for Augustus. And democracy and republic behavior are not that important in that time period. Much more important is to keep the peace and to keep people fed and try to improve the lives of the ordinary person. And on that, I think, there is plenty to be optimistic about.
Okay, no other questions, Steve?
Thank you, Foster. As Miguel indicated, this was a real eye-opener of a talk. For me, it was an eye-opener in terms of the true nature of the Roman Republic. It was an eye-opener in terms of how our founding fathers relied upon the notion of the Roman Republic, or should we say, the idealized version of the Roman Republic. And I think it was a real eye-opener in terms of the true accomplishments of Julius Caesar. I have to tell you, your talk was far more interesting than my Latin classes back in the day. And speaking of Latin, we've had a little bit of discussion, including a comment from one of our guests, Jacqueline, in terms of the appropriate pronunciation. And it brought back a memory I had in Latin class, in which our teacher said that you have to understand that there's a difference in pronunciation depending upon whether you go to a private or a public school. For example, Caesar's great line of, I came, I saw, I conquered after the Battle of Zela would be pronounced Veni Vidi Vici in one school, but Veni Vidi Vici in another. You can imagine which one he preferred. Thank you again, Foster. We very much appreciate it. As you know, we have two ways of thanking our speakers. The first is with a certificate of appreciation. And for the benefit of those among us who are guests, you'll notice that there's an orchid on that certificate. And there's a very good reason for that. Back in 1930, when the Old Guard was founded, the city of Summit was at the epicenter of the nation's orchid growing and distribution industry. And so it was only natural for our founders to pick the orchid as our logo. There's also a second way that we thank our guests. And if we can unmute everyone now, what we would like to provide you, Foster, with is the Old Guard salute.
Hey.
Thank you.